The morning sun blazed down on the long stretch of asphalt leading into the U.S. Navy installation, turning the air into waves of heat that shimmered above the ground. Dust rose behind Ethan Ward's car as he slowed, approaching the checkpoint that marked the official entrance to the base. Ethan leaned one arm casually on the steering wheel, his aviator sunglasses perched on his nose, his suit jacket tossed carelessly in the passenger seat. He didn't particularly like military bases, but his new civilian contract with the Navy promised steady money, and for Ethan, money was the only real motivator. He told himself that he was smarter than the people who wore uniforms, people who followed orders blindly while he thrived on his own terms. As the line of vehicles inched forward, Ethan sighed dramatically. "Figures," he muttered, drumming his fingers on the wheel. "Hurry up and wait. That's the military for you." When his car rolled to a stop, his eyes landed on the security checkpoint ahead. A lone female guard stood at her post, rifle slung across her chest, reflective sunglasses hiding her eyes. She looked composed, rigid posture, uniform perfectly pressed, boots planted firmly. Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Of course," he whispered. "Leave it to the Navy to put a woman on gate duty. Probably just decoration." He rolled his window down as the line advanced, but his gaze never left the guard. She wasn't moving much, only scanning vehicles with a deliberate rhythm. Ethan thought she looked too serious, like she was trying too hard to play soldier. He pictured her as the type who'd memorized rules, but never actually tested herself in the field. When his turn finally came, she approached, her boots clicking softly on the pavement. "Morning, sir. Identification, please." Her voice was calm, professional, and firm. Ethan smirked as he handed over his badge. "Here you go, officer," he said, exaggerating the last word. "How's gate duty treating you today?" "Bet it's a real thrill ride." The guard didn't respond. She studied his ID carefully, scanning it before looking briefly at his face. Her silence only encouraged him. "You know," Ethan continued, leaning an elbow against his window frame, "I used to think the military only put their best people at the front lines. But I guess somebody's got to wave cars through and look intimidating. Can't all be action heroes, right?" Her expression didn't change. She handed his ID back without a word. That silence irritated Ethan more than if she'd snapped at him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to prove she wasn't as tough as she looked. "What's your story, anyway?" he asked, voice laced with mockery. "Didn't qualify for pilot school? Couldn't handle infantry training? Or maybe this is just an easy paycheck for you. Stand here, look stern, scare the occasional contractor like me." Still nothing. She only looked past him toward the next vehicle in line. The heat pressed down harder. Sweat prickled at Ethan's neck, but he forced another chuckle, louder this time so others in line could hear. "Bet when things get serious, you're handing out parking tickets on base, huh? Gotta keep those speeders in check. Real battlefield stuff." A couple of junior, enlisted men behind him shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew better than to say anything, but their eyes flicked between Ethan and the guard, waiting for the inevitable crack in composure or worse, a reprimand that would drop on Ethan like a hammer. But the guard didn't flinch. Her stillness, her refusal to engage, was calculated. She wasn't ignoring him. She was demonstrating something he couldn't understand: discipline. Ethan mistook that restraint for weakness. He leaned back in his seat with a smug grin. To him, she was just another person in uniform, someone lower on the ladder, probably dreaming of proving herself someday, but stuck with the boring job of scanning IDs. Ethan prided himself on reading people, but in this moment, he was blind. He didn't know her name was Major Harper. He didn't know she had served in Afghanistan and Iraq, leading combat missions that had tested her in ways he couldn't imagine. He didn't know she had trained with SEAL teams, commanded joint operations, and earned respect that no words could diminish. All Ethan saw was a woman in uniform standing at a gate. And to him, that was laughable. He sighed again, theatrically this time, making sure others noticed. "Well," he said, handing her back the ID she had already returned just to be petty. "Thanks for the warm welcome. You're doing a great job, keeping all us scary contractors in line." She didn't even glance at him. With one sharp motion, she gestured for the next car, dismissing him entirely. Ethan chuckled and drove forward, shaking his head. "Figures. Can't even take a joke," he muttered to himself. But the people in line, those who had seen the interaction, who knew exactly who Major Harper really was, exchanged silent looks. They knew something Ethan didn't. They knew that silence wasn't weakness. It was power. And soon, Ethan was about to discover just how badly. He had misjudged the quiet strength of the female guard he thought was beneath him. The base was alive with its usual rhythm: soldiers marching, Humvees moving supplies, flags snapping in the wind. But for Ethan, that morning was just beginning. He thought he had outwitted a guard with his smug jokes. In truth, he had just written the opening lines of a story that would humiliate him in front of the very warriors he idolized. Ethan parked his car in the designated lot, the sun glaring down as he swung his door shut. He adjusted his sunglasses and smoothed his shirt, still carrying the smug satisfaction of what he thought had been a clever exchange with the female guard. "Stone-faced," he muttered under his breath. "Typical military. No humor at all." He walked toward the administration building, where contractors were supposed to check in. The base was alive with the sound of boots striking pavement, radios crackling, and distant aircraft engines powering up. It was a place humming with focus, discipline, and quiet purpose, things Ethan neither noticed nor appreciated. Inside the waiting area, he spotted the same female guard stationed by the entrance now, maintaining her position. She hadn't looked at him once after their earlier encounter, and that fact seemed to gnaw at him. Ethan thrived on reactions. Silence felt like defeat, and he couldn't stand the thought of anyone, especially a woman in uniform, shrugging him off so completely. So he opened his mouth again. "Well, look who's still holding the fort," he said with a crooked smile, his voice pitched just loud enough for others in the room to hear. "Gotta hand it to you. This is dedication. Guarding doors, waving people in. Critical stuff. The enemy must be terrified." The young sailor at the reception desk stiffened slightly, eyes flicking between Ethan and the guard. The room's atmosphere grew taut, though Ethan remained oblivious to it. The guard, Major Harper, didn't respond. Her expression remained unreadable, her hands steady on her rifle. Ethan leaned against the wall casually, as if he were talking to an old acquaintance. "You know, I've seen enough movies to know who does the real fighting. SEALs, Rangers, Marines. Guys who actually go into combat. No offense, but gate duty? Not exactly Medal of Honor material." A murmur rippled through the small cluster of personnel waiting nearby. Some lowered their heads, hiding smiles, not because they agreed with Ethan, but because they knew just how far off the mark he was. A couple of enlisted men shot sympathetic glances at Harper, though she gave no sign that the words bothered her. Her stillness was a shield one Ethan misinterpreted as weakness. "You must get tired of it, right?" Ethan pressed, chuckling. "Standing around all day, while the real action happens somewhere else. Ever think about getting a job with TSA? At least they get to take people's shoes off." A few muffled laughs escaped from the back of the room, not aimed at Harper, but at the sheer foolishness of Ethan's arrogance. Still, he puffed up, mistaking their reaction as approval. He stepped closer to the guard now, lowering his voice, but keeping the edge of mockery sharp. "Tell me something. When's the last time you actually fired that rifle?" Or do you just polish it and pose for base photos? The room went utterly silent. For the first time, Harper turned her head slightly, her mirrored sunglasses reflecting Ethan's smirk. She didn't speak, but the tiniest tilt of her chin conveyed more authority than Ethan could comprehend. That single glance pierced him in a way he hadn't expected. For a fraction of a second, he felt small under her gaze. But his ego, unwilling to admit it, pushed him back into false confidence. He scoffed loudly, covering his unease. "Right," he muttered. "Didn't think so." The receptionist finally broke the silence, calling Ethan forward to sign his paperwork. He swaggered to the desk, signing with exaggerated strokes as if he were sealing $1 million deal. Behind him, Harper hadn't moved. She was a statue calm, composed, unshaken. But others in the room could feel it. Her silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, controlled, the kind of silence only someone with immense authority could wield effectively. Ethan didn't realize it yet, but the more he taunted, the deeper a hole he was digging for himself. Every insult, every careless jab, was storing ammunition, not in Harper's hands, but in the judgmental eyes of everyone watching. By the time Ethan finished signing, whispers were already circulating. A couple of sailors nudged each other, their smirks aimed not at Harper, but at Ethan. They knew something he didn't, and they were content to let him discover it the hard way. Ethan, oblivious, grabbed his packet of documents and turned back toward the guard, tossing one last jab over his shoulder. "Don't worry, soldier," he said with a laugh. "I'll make sure to tell my buddies you're keeping us safe out here. Someone's got to keep the paperwork warriors in check." Still no response. That silence followed him out the door like a shadow, lingering heavier than he realized. It wasn't the silence of weakness. It was the silence of power, the kind that needed no defense because the truth was already stronger than any insult. As Ethan stepped into the sunlight again, striding toward the next checkpoint with his head high, he believed he'd won the exchange. But those who had witnessed it knew better. They knew Ethan had just walked himself into a trap of his own making, one that would soon close around him in a way he could never forget. For now, though, he basked in his delusion. He thought the guard was beneath him. He thought his words had cut deep. What he didn't realize was that the strongest people in the room were the ones who didn't need to answer him. And Major Harper was stronger than any man Ethan had ever met. Soon, he would learn just how wrong he had been. The waiting room felt cooler than the blistering heat outside, but the air was heavy thick with the tension Ethan himself had stirred. Soldiers and sailors came and went, their boots thudding softly on the polished floor, while Major Harper stood as still as a marble statue at her post. For her, this was routine. She had endured stares, whispers, and dismissive comments her entire career. From training academies to deployments overseas, there had always been someone ready to question her ability, simply because she was a woman in uniform. Most of them faded into silence the moment they saw her in action. A few, however, men like Ethan mistook silence for surrender. She had learned long ago that reacting gave people like him exactly what they wanted. Silence, on the other hand, unsettled them. Silence forced them to confront themselves. Ethan didn't see it that way. To him, Harper's stillness was a confirmation that he had gotten under her skin. He sprawled into one of the waiting chairs, stretching his legs with an exaggerated yawn. "Quiet as ever," he said loudly, drawing the attention of two junior sailors, flipping through paperwork. "I'm starting to wonder if she's even allowed to talk without permission." A couple of snickers broke out in the corner. Ethan smirked, emboldened. He mistook the nervous laughter as approval when, in truth, it was disbelief at his audacity. "Tell me something," Ethan continued, raising his voice as though he were addressing the entire room. "Do they rotate you guys on shifts? Or is this like a permanent post watching doors, saluting cars, Maybe confiscating someone's lunch if they sneak it in? Still, Harper gave no reply. Her silence wasn't passive. It was layered, intentional. Behind her dark glasses, her eyes swept the room, evaluating, observing, memorizing every face. Years of combat had sharpened her instincts until moments like these required no thought. She had seen far worse than Ethan. Men with rifles pointed at her, villages under siege, comrades bleeding out under fire. Compared to those moments, this one barely registered. But to Ethan, her restraint was infuriating. "You're good at this," he said, grinning. "Most people can't keep a straight face when I'm messing with them. But you're like a robot. Maybe that's why they picked you for this post. Don't need personality when all you gotta do is stand still." A sailor across the room raised his head, his jaw tightening. He looked ready to intervene, but Harper gave the faintest shake of her head. A signal. She didn't need rescuing. Ethan saw the gesture, but misunderstood it completely. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, voice dropping into a mock conspiratorial tone. "See? That's the thing about this place. Everyone pretends they're so tough, but the real jobs, the hard stuff, gets handled by the guys we actually read about. SEALs, Rangers, pilots. Hell, even drone operators probably do more than gate duty." One of the sailors muttered under his breath, "You have no idea." His words weren't meant for Ethan, but the sting of them hung in the air. Ethan tilted his head, smirk deepening. "Oh, I get it. You're all protecting her. Don't worry, I'm just joking. I mean, hey, she's got the stance down, I'll give her that. Looks professional. Just doesn't scream. Warrior, you know." This time, Harper finally turned her head, slowly. Her mirrored lenses reflected Ethan's face back at him, a distorted version of his smug grin. For a moment, he faltered. Something about the way she looked at him, not anger, not annoyance, but something sharper made his chest tighten. But then his ego shoved the doubt aside, and he chuckled nervously. "Yeah, okay," he said, shifting in his seat. "I get it. You're not gonna break character. Fair enough." Harper straightened again, her body language returning to perfect stillness. Her silence had spoken more than any words could. The room remained tense. The enlisted personnel shuffled papers, whispering quietly, but their eyes lingered on Ethan. Some pitied him already, knowing he was digging himself deeper by the minute. Others enjoyed the anticipation, recognizing that something was coming, though Ethan remained blind to it. "Guess I'll just sit here then," Ethan muttered, leaning back once more. "Until the real action starts. You know, whenever the important people show up." Behind his smugness, though, a sliver of unease wormed its way into his thoughts. He didn't like that her silence unsettled him. He didn't like that he couldn't get the reaction he wanted. But his pride refused to admit it. Instead, he doubled down, determined to prove to himself, to the room, to Harper, that he was in control. He didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had already shifted. Every word he had spoken, every arrogant laugh, had only made Harper's silence more powerful. And soon, when the important people arrived, Ethan would learn that her strength wasn't in what she said, but in what she commanded. The afternoon sun had begun to slide lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the Navy installation. The waiting area was nearly full now, a steady flow of sailors, contractors, and visiting officers moving in and out. The low hum of conversation filled the space paper shuffled, boots echoed, chairs scraped against the floor. Ethan sat sprawled in his chair near the entrance, radiating arrogance. He had run out of jokes for the moment, but his smirk remained plastered on his face. In his mind, the female guard's silence was proof that she had no power, no authority, and no real purpose beyond standing still with a weapon she probably never used. To Ethan, this was just another easy win. He loved feeling like the smartest man in the room, even when no one else was laughing with him. But the mood of the building was about to change. It began subtly. A faint rumble in the distance, like the growl of an approaching storm. People in the waiting area paused mid-sentence, ears tuning to the sound. The vibrations grew stronger, a deep mechanical hum rolling across the base. Engines, heavy ones. Within moments, the sound was unmistakable, the low, throaty roar of armored vehicles. The kind that didn't move unless something important was happening. Conversations died. Even the reception clerk stood a little taller, glancing toward the windows. Ethan leaned forward, curious. His smirk widened. "What's this? The cavalry?" He muttered, chuckling. Through the glass, the convoy came into view. A line of matte black SUVs, followed by tactical trucks, rolled down the access road with mechanical precision. Dust swirled around their tires, catching the sunlight like smoke. The doors of the waiting room opened, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Navy SEALs stepped inside. They moved with a presence that needed no announcement. Broad shoulders, battle-tested gear strapped tight across their bodies, rifles slung with casual lethality. Their eyes scanned the room instinctively, assessing every angle, every exit. Each motion was deliberate, synchronized, honed by years of discipline. The air seemed to grow heavier with their arrival. Conversations ceased altogether. The only sound was the rhythmic stomp of boots as they entered in formation. Even Ethan felt it. A strange tightness in his chest, an instinctive response to men who radiated an energy he couldn't quite define. Still, he forced his grin back into place. "Now, here are the real warriors," he said under his breath, loud enough for those nearest to hear. He gestured toward Harper with a tilt of his head. "Better take notes, sweetheart. This is what combat looks like." The remark drew no laughter this time, only silence. The sailors who had endured Ethan's earlier taunts exchanged looks, their anticipation sharpening. The SEALs advanced deeper into the room. Then something unexpected happened, something that made Ethan's grin falter. They didn't move past Harper. They didn't ignore her like he assumed they would. Instead, the lead operator, a man with the presence of granite and scars that told 100 stories, stopped directly in front of her. The room collectively held its breath. The SEAL's hand snapped up in a sharp salute, his voice cutting through the silence like steel. "Major Harper," he said firmly, "we're here and ready for your orders." The rest of the SEALs followed in unison, their salutes crisp, unwavering, and steeped in respect. Ethan blinked. The words didn't register at first. His brain struggled to reconcile the scene before him. "Major?" he whispered, his throat suddenly dry. Harper's posture shifted slightly, the smallest adjustment, but it was enough. She returned the salute with calm authority, her voice carrying the weight of command. "At ease, gentlemen. We'll brief in 10. The SEALs lowered their salutes in perfect synchronization, then took their positions, waiting silently for her instructions. Not one of them questioned her presence. Not one of them looked surprised. To them, she was not a guard. She was their leader. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, every ounce of arrogance draining from him. The smirk that had clung stubbornly to his face slipped away entirely, replaced by disbelief. His earlier words replayed in his head like echoes pretending to be military. Just decoration. Gate duty isn't real combat. The irony crushed him. Around the room, sailors and clerks stole glances at Ethan. Some smirked openly now, enjoying the reversal. Others simply shook their heads, marveling at his ignorance. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. He tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat, coming out as a strangled cough. "Major," he muttered again, almost to himself, as if saying the word would make it make sense. Harper finally turned toward him, slowly, deliberately. Her mirrored sunglasses locked on his face, reflecting the image of a man who had just realized he was nothing more than a fool. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was no longer restraint. It was judgment. Ethan wanted to disappear. For the first time all day, he felt the crushing weight of a truth he couldn't joke his way out of. The person he had mocked, belittled, and dismissed wasn't just a soldier. She was the commanding officer of the most elite warriors on the planet. The atmosphere in the waiting room had shifted entirely. Where once Ethan thought he held the upper hand, now he was buried beneath a mountain of respect directed at Harper. The SEALs stood tall, awaiting her orders. The sailors sat straighter in their chairs, their eyes filled with admiration. And Ethan? Ethan sat there trembling slightly, a man exposed, humiliated, and small. The shift wasn't just in the atmosphere of the room. It was inside him, too. The foundation of his arrogance had cracked. And as Harper's calm, commanding presence filled the space, Ethan realized this was only the beginning of the lesson he would never forget. The waiting room had become a theater of silence. The SEALs stood tall, rifles slung across their chests, their eyes steady, their discipline unshaken. Every movement seemed precise, as though even stillness was part of their training. Ethan sat pinned in his chair, his earlier arrogance burned away by the weight of what he had just witnessed. Major Harper. The title still echoed in his skull, each syllable sharper than the last. His mind raced, replaying every smug comment, every dismissive gesture, every word he had thrown at her like stones. She hadn't reacted then. She hadn't even blinked. And now he understood why. She didn't need to. She had been standing there with the patience of someone who knew the battlefield always reveals the truth eventually. And now the battlefield wasn't some distant desert or city street. It was this very room, with Ethan's pride collapsing under the sheer weight of reality. The clerk behind the desk pretended to shuffle papers, but everyone could see her fighting back a smirk. The sailors who had endured Ethan's jeers earlier sat rigid, their eyes flicking between him and Harper with barely contained satisfaction. For a long moment, Harper said nothing. She simply stood, composed, letting the silence work as effectively as any reprimand. Ethan coughed nervously, trying to fill the void. I didn't realize." His words came out halting, stripped of the bravado that had once coated them. I thought you were just—" He stopped himself. The word just tasted wrong now. Harper finally spoke, her tone calm but edged with steel. "Just what?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Ethan swallowed. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. "Say it," she continued, her voice even, her gaze unwavering. "Go ahead." "You thought I was just what?" He stammered, his throat tightening. "A guard. I thought you were just standing watch. Not worthy of respect?" She finished for him. The words cut through him. He nodded weakly, unable to meet her eyes. The SEALs shifted slightly, not in threat but in solidarity. Every man in that formation radiated respect toward Harper, and the contrast to Ethan's earlier mockery made his humiliation unbearable. Harper didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The authority in her calm tone carried more weight than any shouting ever could. A soldier is never just anything. Remember that. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Even the sailors felt it, their heads nodding subtly in agreement. Ethan's cheeks burned. He had thought himself clever, thought he had the upper hand with his sharp tongue. But now he realized that words meant nothing compared to presence, discipline, and the silent power of respect. For the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his own ignorance. Harper turned her attention away from him, without another glance, as though dismissing his existence entirely. To her, he was irrelevant. A lesson had been delivered, and she had bigger matters at hand. "Briefing room," she ordered the SEALs, her tone shifting seamlessly into command mode. 5 minutes. "Yes, ma'am," the lead operator replied, his voice firm. The SEALs moved as one, filing toward the briefing area with perfect synchronization. The waiting room seemed to breathe again as they left, though the silence lingered in Ethan's chest. He sat still, his arrogance shattered, his mind replaying the moment again and again. Harper paused at the door before following them. For a brief second, she turned her head slightly, her mirrored lenses catching the dim light. Her words were low, meant only for him, yet sharp enough to pierce through the remaining scraps of his pride. "You might want to learn the difference between mocking and understanding," she said. "One builds nothing. The other might just save your life." Then she was gone. The door closed behind her, and Ethan was left in the echo of his own humiliation. But the lesson didn't end there. The sailors began to move again, murmuring quietly, stealing glances at him. Some shook their heads in disappointment, others smirked at his downfall. One young petty officer leaned toward him, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's Major Harper. She's led missions you couldn't imagine. The fact you're still breathing after taunting her is a miracle." Ethan's stomach churned. He wanted to defend himself, to claim ignorance, to laugh it off as a joke. But he knew it wouldn't work. No excuse could erase the spectacle he had just made of himself. He stared down at the floor, his reflection dimly visible in the polished tile. The man looking back at him wasn't confident or clever anymore. He was small, exposed, stripped of the false armor of arrogance. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected: respect. Not the shallow kind he demanded with jokes and bravado, but the kind that grew heavy in the chest, unshakable, unearned, but undeniable. He had mocked her silence, her composure, her watchful eyes. Now he understood. Those very qualities were the mark of someone who had earned their place through grit, sacrifice, and unspoken strength. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a deep sigh escaping his chest. He wasn't sure what stung more, the humiliation of being exposed or the realization of how wrong he had been. One thing was certain: he would never look at another soldier the same way again. The silence of the room lingered like a scar, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from shouting, but from being confronted with a truth you cannot escape. And Ethan had just been confronted with the greatest truth of all. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned. The clang of steel doors echoed through the corridors as the SEALs disappeared deeper into the facility. The faint hum of ventilation filled the silence that followed, leaving Ethan sitting alone in the waiting room, his thoughts unraveling. He should have left. Every instinct told him to get out before he embarrassed himself further. But something kept him rooted to the chair. Maybe it was shame. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the nagging need to understand how a woman he had dismissed so easily commanded such respect from some of the toughest men alive. 10 minutes later, the silence was broken by a voice over the intercom. "All non-essential personnel clear the hallways. Training exercise commencing in 5. The clerk behind the desk looked up. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan, who was still sitting stiffly. "That includes you," she said. But before Ethan could rise, a new sound filled the air. Heavy boots, moving in rhythm. He glanced over his shoulder and saw them, the SEALs, returning, helmets on, vests strapped, weapons primed for a training simulation. And at their head, walking with the unshakable calm of a born leader, was Major Harper. She didn't glance at him. Didn't need to. Her presence spoke for itself. "Drill parameters?" Harper asked, her voice steady. "Urban breach, hostage rescue, the lead petty officer replied. Sim rounds. 2 hostile units. Good, Harper said with a short nod. Team Alpha, flank from the east corridor. Bravo with me. The SEALs moved instantly, splitting into formation without hesitation. Ethan's eyes widened. He had expected her to hang back, to supervise, maybe to issue orders from behind a desk. Instead, she was walking point. The intercom crackled again. Exercise begins in 3, 2, 1. A deafening bang shattered the quiet as the first breaching charge ignited down the hall. Smoke hissed, boots thundered, and shouts echoed through the facility. The simulation had begun. Ethan's body reacted instinctively, heart racing, palms damp, breath catching in his throat. It felt real, too real. The sound of gunfire reverberated through the metal walls, and he ducked lower in his chair, even though he wasn't the target. Through the haze of smoke spilling into the hallway, he glimpsed Harper. She moved low, controlled, her rifle steady as she advanced with her team. Every motion was efficient, no wasted steps, no unnecessary gestures. Room clear. 1 SEAL barked. 2 hostiles down. Another called. Harper swept her weapon across the corridor, then signaled with 2 sharp fingers. Move! Ethan had never seen anything like it. He had watched action movies, seen news clips, even bragged about his tactical knowledge from video games and documentaries. But none of that prepared him for the sheer precision of the real thing. These weren't actors. These weren't pixels on a screen. They were flesh and blood, men and women who had drilled this choreography until it was second nature. And at the center of it all was the woman he had mocked. The guard, he thought was just standing watch, was now leading one of the most elite fighting forces in the world through a scenario that simulated the very missions whispered about in military history. They cleared another hallway, smoke curling around their boots. Harper crouched at a doorframe, her hand raised. She waited, listening. Her instincts were razor sharp. Ethan could almost feel the electricity in the air as she judged the moment. Then, with a decisive gesture, she signaled breach. Another explosion rocked the air. The SEALs surged forward, shouting commands, engaging with the precision of a machine. Harper was the first through the doorway, her voice cutting through the chaos. Hostage secured. The room exploded in motion, the SEALs shielding their mock hostages, pulling them back with the urgency of men who had done this too many times in real life. It was over in minutes. The intercom crackled again. Exercise complete. Time, 5 minutes, 36 seconds. Mission success. The smoke began to settle. The SEALs regrouped, their helmets still down, their weapons slung. Harper stood at the center, scanning each man with sharp eyes, her posture steady. Report, she ordered. Each SEAL gave their after-action assessment with crisp professionalism. Harper nodded, acknowledging, correcting, fine-tuning. She didn't bark. She didn't posture. She listened, analyzed, adjusted. And they respected her for it. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched. He felt like an intruder, a child peering into a world he had no right to mock. Everything about this scene contrasted with the arrogance he had shown earlier. When the SEALs finally removed their helmets, sweat streaked their faces, but their expressions were composed. They turned to Harper, awaiting her final word. Good work, she said. But next time, Bravo, tighten your spacing on the breach. You left a gap that could have cost a life. Alpha, your flank was clean. Keep it that way. Her feedback was sharp but fair, and the men didn't flinch at correction. They nodded with quiet respect, absorbing her words like gospel. The drill ended. The SEALs dispersed, some toward the showers, others toward the debriefing room. Harper stayed behind for a moment, adjusting the strap of her vest. She turned slightly, her mirrored glasses catching the hallway light, and for the briefest second, her gaze flicked toward Ethan. He froze. There was no gloating in her look, no satisfaction at his humiliation, just calm acknowledgement, as if she were silently telling him, "This is who I am. This is who I've always been. You just refuse to see it." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to admit he had been wrong, but the words tangled in his chest. Instead, he sat in silence, the echo of gunfire still ringing in his ears. The image of Harper leading men through smoke and chaos burned permanently into his memory. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized what true strength looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't boastful. It didn't need validation. It was silent, steady, and unshakable. And it stood in front of him, wearing mirrored glasses and a uniform he would never again dare to underestimate. The corridor smelled faintly of gunpowder and sweat, the remnants of the drill still lingering in the air. Ethan remained seated long after the SEALs had dispersed, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. He could still hear the echo of simulated gunfire ringing in his ears. Could still see the image of Harper kicking through that door, steady and fearless, commanding men who would follow her into real hell without hesitation. He wanted to leave God. He wanted to get up and walk away, disappear before anyone else could remind him of what a fool he had made of himself. But shame pinned him to the chair, heavy as lead. The urge to apologize warred with the fear that his words would sound hollow, or worse, that she wouldn't even give him the chance. The door opened. Major Harper stepped back into the waiting room, no longer in her helmet and vest, but still in full uniform, her presence no less commanding. She carried a folder in one hand, her posture as crisp as it had been at her post outside the building hours earlier. Her eyes still hidden behind those mirrored lenses, swept across the room. They landed on Ethan. She paused. For the first time that day, Ethan felt like he was the one under guard. He stood too quickly, the legs of his chair scraping against the tile. "Major," his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, forcing steadiness. "Major Harper, I need to say something." She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head slightly, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The words felt clumsy in his mouth. He had always been quick with jokes, sharp with comebacks, confident with bravado. But this wasn't a locker room or a bar. This was different. This was real. "I was wrong," he blurted. "Everything I said earlier, the way I acted, it was disrespectful, ignorant. I thought I was being funny. I wasn't. I was an idiot." The room was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Harper didn't move. She didn't soften. She stood still, her face unreadable behind her glasses, her silence forcing him to keep talking. Ethan swallowed hard. "The truth is, I thought you were just standing there, you know? Like it was some easy post. Like you didn't matter. But watching you today, seeing the way you lead them," his voice faltered, "you're more than I ever understood. And I disrespected that." Still, Harper said nothing. The silence was crushing. Ethan's shoulders sagged under it. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and shame mixing until he could barely stand still. "I don't expect forgiveness," he admitted finally. "I don't even deserve you listening to me. But I needed to say it. You deserve better than what I gave you." For a long moment, Harper let the words hang in the air. Her stillness made him squirm, but her silence was no longer the same as before. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of judgment, of weighing, of deciding whether his apology was worth acknowledging. At last she spoke. "You think an apology erases what was said?" Her voice was calm, but sharp, like a blade pressed lightly against skin. Ethan shook his head quickly. No, it doesn't. I know that. Good, she said. Because words, once spoken, can't be taken back. They leave marks. Sometimes small, sometimes deep. And people remember. He nodded, his chest tightening. I understand. Harper stepped closer, her boots clicking softly against the tile. Now she was only a few feet away, close enough that Ethan could see his own reflection in her mirrored lenses. He looked small, nervous, stripped of everything he thought made him strong. You were quick to judge, she continued. Quick to assume. Quick to mock. Do you know how many times I've seen men like that? Men who measure others without ever stopping to understand them. Ethan lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. Too many, she said. And do you know what happens to them? He didn't answer. They learn the hard way. Sometimes in a room like this. Sometimes in the middle of a mission, when arrogance gets people killed. The weight of her words sank into his gut. He felt smaller than ever. But then, her tone shifted just slightly. You admitted you were wrong. That matters. Most don't. Ethan's head lifted, surprised. That doesn't mean you're absolved, she added quickly. Respect isn't earned in a single apology. It's earned in choices, day after day, moment after moment. I want to learn, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. I don't want to be that guy again. Not after today. For the first time, Harper removed her glasses. Her eyes were sharp, steady, but not unkind. She studied him for several long seconds, as though searching for the truth in his words. Then prove it, she said simply. Ethan blinked. Prove it? Yes, Harper said, sliding her glasses back into place. Not to me. To yourself. To the people you meet after today. Show them you learned something here. That you're not as shallow as your first impression made you out to be. Her words were a challenge, not a comfort. But Ethan felt something shift in his chest. A spark. A weight. A responsibility. I will, he said quietly, but with conviction. I promise. Harper gave a single nod. No smile, no handshake. Just acknowledgement. Then she walked past him, toward the exit. Ethan stood frozen, watching her leave. The sound of her boots faded down the corridor, leaving him once again in silence. But this time, the silence didn't feel crushing. It felt heavy with meaning. He wasn't sure if she believed his words. He wasn't even sure if he believed them yet. But he knew one thing for certain. He would never forget this moment. And he would never again underestimate someone who stood in silence, because he now understood that silence could hold more power than words ever could. The evening sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in deep streaks of orange and violet. The base, once alive with the chaos of drills and movement, had begun to settle into its quiet rhythm. Vehicles hummed at the perimeter. Boots shuffled along walkways. And the faint call of orders drifted across the grounds, a reminder that the work of soldiers never truly ended. Ethan walked slowly across the lot, his hands buried in his pockets, his mind heavier than his steps. Every detail of the day replayed in his head like a film stuck on loop. The smugness in his voice when he mocked Harper, the mirrored stillness of her stance, the way the SEALs had addressed her with unshakable respect, and finally, the truth of who she was, Major Harper, leader, warrior, a force he had underestimated until it was too late. But it wasn't just humiliation that weighed on him now. It was something deeper, something uncomfortable but necessary, respect. He stopped near the edge of the lot, watching the flag flutter in the fading light. Soldiers passing by saluted as they moved, their discipline unwavering, their movements crisp. Ethan felt like an outsider still, but not in the same way as before. Earlier, he had thought himself above the silence, above the ritual. Now, he realized he had never even stepped close to understanding it. The silence, the composure, the restraint, it wasn't weakness. It was control. It was strength. And Harper embodied it in every way. A young sailor brushed past him, pausing just long enough to mutter, "Brave of you to apologize." Most wouldn't. Ethan turned, startled, but the sailor was already gone, lost in the sea of uniforms. The words lingered, though, like a small spark inside him. He hadn't thought his apology mattered. Not really. Harper hadn't offered forgiveness, not outright. She hadn't given him a pat on the back or absolved him with easy words. But she had listened. She had acknowledged. And most importantly, she had challenged him to prove it. The challenge burned in his mind. He walked a little further, stopping near the chain-link fence that bordered the base. Beyond it lay the civilian world he belonged to, his world of bars, locker room jokes, and shallow bravado. It seemed distant now. Small. He thought of Harper leading the SEALs through smoke and fire, her voice steady, her presence unshakable. He thought of her words, "Respect isn't earned in a single apology. It's earned in choices, day after day, moment after moment." Those words lodged themselves deep in him, heavier than shame, sharper than guilt. He didn't know if he would ever see her again. Maybe this was it, one day, one lesson, one humiliation that would carve itself into his memory. But maybe that was enough. He straightened slightly, pulling his hands free of his pockets. For once, he didn't feel the urge to joke, to cover silence with noise. Instead, he let the quiet of the evening settle around him. And in that silence, he found something he had never expected: clarity. The ride home was long, the road stretching endlessly beneath the glow of headlights. Ethan barely noticed the passing scenery. His mind was still on the base, on the waiting room, on the moment the SEALs had stood at attention for Harper. He replayed the sound of their voices. "Yes, ma'am." The certainty, the respect, the way even the toughest among them carried themselves differently around her. He thought of his own voice, earlier mocking, arrogant, shallow. The memory made his chest tighten. Never again, he promised himself. He pulled into his driveway well past dark. The house loomed quiet, windows glowing faintly with the light left on inside. He sat for a moment in the car, engine off, staring at his reflection in the windshield. He didn't see the same man who had walked into that waiting room. He saw someone raw, stripped down, unsettled. But he also saw potential someone who had been humbled, yes, but who could choose to become better because of it. The words returned, steady and sharp. "Then prove it." Ethan nodded to himself. Weeks later, the lesson hadn't faded. It had only deepened. At work, he caught himself before making a cheap joke at a colleague's expense. At the gym, he found himself holding back when others mocked the new guy struggling with weights. And in the quiet moments on long drives, late nights, he thought of Harper, of her mirrored glasses, of her silence. Silence had once unnerved him. Now it steadied him. For the first time, Ethan understood that real strength didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need noise. It didn't need validation. Real strength stood watch at a post without complaint. Real strength walked into fire without hesitation. Real strength listened, commanded, and endured. And Major Harper had shown him all of it. Months later, Ethan returned to the base, not as a brash visitor, but as someone who wanted to see, to understand, to pay respect. He stood outside the gates, watching soldiers march past, wondering if Harper was somewhere inside, still leading, still commanding, still unshaken. He didn't approach. He didn't need to, because in truth, she had already left her mark on him. The lesson she had given him wasn't hers to repeat. It was his to carry. And he carried it well. Years later, When Ethan told the story, he never softened the details. He admitted to his arrogance, his taunting, his ignorance. He admitted how small he had felt when the seals addressed her as Major. But he also told the part that mattered most, the part about silence, about strength, about the moment he realized that respect isn't demanded or assumed. It's earned quietly, steadily, through actions no words can diminish. It became his story to share, not as a boast, but as a warning, a reminder. And every time he told it, he ended with the same truth he had learned that day. You never really know who's standing in front of you. So respect them. Always. Because silence doesn't mean weakness. It means strength you haven't yet understood.